They're still pouring in, but I'm going to get started to introduce John Lindback, who will speak to us today about the unparalleled ERIC system and the advantages of online voter registration. John is a senior officer with election initiatives at the Pew Charitable Trust. He's no stranger to the difficulties that election officials face. He has 14 years of experience, both in Oregon, across Oregon and Alaska, working in election administration, and he's personally lived the joys and the sorrows of that type of role. In 2008, John was also elected as president of the National Association of State Elections Directors. He has a deep understanding of what this new technology in online voter registration bodes for us and what it brings to state election administration. We're very excited to have him right here, right now, and he's itching to get on, so he gets his time. I'll hand it to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I get started, I wanted to put in a plug for the reception this afternoon. The Pew Charitable Trust is sponsoring the reception, and so I encourage you all to attend and enjoy yourself, and because Pew's buying the drinks, so you want to take advantage of that. So it was almost 4 years ago now that I went to work for the Pew Center on the States, and for those of you who knew me in my old role as the Director of Elections in Oregon, and prior to that, Chief of Staff to the Lieutenant Governor of Alaska, a job that had carried with it oversight of the Alaska Division of Elections. This has been a new role for me. In fact, I have an older brother who, typical of older brothers, loves to make fun of his younger brother. And he tells people that, that John, his first career was in newspapers, because I have a degree in journalism and I was a newspaper reporter. That's how I started out in life. His first career was in newspapers, and you all know how that's going for newspapers. His second career was in government. You know how that's going. So now he's seeing what he can do to drive philanthropy under the bus. And I have to tell you that working for the Pew Center on the States has been a pure joy. And one of the reasons that I was interested in doing it and wanted to do it was because I knew well that this organization had the resources to be a driver in innovation in elections. I had felt for several years after being a chief elections administrator that voter registration was a serious problem in the U.S. It had serious shortcomings, that it could be better for both the voter and the elections administrator, and that we needed some innovation and we needed somebody to be a driver. And I remember talking to our friend Michael Caudell-Fagan at Pew and telling him, if Pew is interested in driving some innovation in voter registration, I would be willing to leave my job as Director of Elections in Oregon to work on it. And one thing led to another, and that led me to going to work for them in 2009 and going to work on a project to develop a creature called ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. And that's why I'm here to talk to you today, to provide you a progress report on how that's going. But for those of you that aren't familiar with the project, I'm going to give you a little bit of history. I'm also going to give you a little bit of data. But hopefully, after about 15 to 20 minutes here, you'll get the Cliff Notes version of where we are with this project, and I can answer some of your questions. And then Susan will want to bring out the hook and get me off the stage, I'm sure. But let's move forward. First of all, I have to apologize to everybody because I was a little late in getting these slides to Susan and her crew, and as a result, they didn't have much time to work on them. And so the formatting of some of these slides is just a little bit off. But I think we'll be able to make it through it. But it's, believe me, entirely my fault. We call our project Upgrading Voter Registration, or Bringing Voter Registration into the 21st Century. And as I explain in a few minutes, it has three major components to it. ERIC is just one of them, but I'll get into more of those details in a second. First of all, I need to tell you about the Pew Center on the States. What it is, for those of you that are not familiar, it's a division within the Pew Charitable Trusts, and it works to deliver better results in government programs, both through achieving long-term fiscal health through budget discipline and making smart investments in programs that provide strong returns. And I think if you keep that goal in mind, you'll see how the ERIC project and the voter registration project at Pew in particular fits very well into the Pew Center on the State's overall goals and mission. When we first sat down to talk about this, the problems with voter registration in this country seem to fall within three areas. One of them is accuracy, the other is cost effectiveness, and the third is efficiency. We call it the ACE framework, and so we have moved ahead with the development of this project and the way we talk about this project by talking about those three areas specifically with regards to weaknesses in voter registration. Just to give you an example, at least going into this election, we knew that there were approximately 24 million voter registration records in this country, or 1 in 8 registrations that are significantly inaccurate or no longer valid. And what does that lead to? It leads to problems at the polls. We know from some survey information that has been gathered already on Election Day in 2012 that 3% of all the voters experienced a voter registration problem at the polls. As a percentage, that number may sound small, but in reality, that's approximately 3.9 million voters. And if you think about it, in reality, that's a state. That's a moderate-sized state. That's 2 small states. That's unacceptable. And so there are serious problems to be rectified. We also know from that survey that 9% of the voters reported they knew someone who tried to vote but was unable to, and so those 3% are out there telling their friends. We also know going into this election, because we've taken a look at the data, that there are voters who are registered in more than one state, and that's because, as you know, people are mobile and they move from one state to another. And they leave an old voter registration behind and they register to vote in their new state. And the old one stays around a while. And sometimes it stays around a while because of the requirements of the National Voter Registration Act. And it just takes some time to be able to cancel registrations in an old state. But one of the things that when we sort of peeked beneath the covers that we discovered is that there were about 2.7 million people with registrations in 2 states. We turned up about almost 69,000 people with registrations in 3 states and 1,800 people with registrations in more than 3. And so this sort of illustrates to you the mobility issues we have in this country and one of the challenges that elections administrators have in keeping up with the mobility of the American voters. We also know that about 1 in 8 people move every year, and that issue is particularly acute among younger voters, that about 1 in 4 young people move every year. So a serious issue, a serious challenge for the election system to keep up with. We know in terms of costs that some of the costs that plague the system are printing of millions of paper forms, data entry by hand, return mail, and processing costs at the local elections offices. So picture your local elections office right around election time. If your state has a deadline, all of a sudden cartloads of voter registration cards or forms are delivered on paper, and you bring in a crew of temporary employees to sit down and input all that data. And frankly, it's not a minor matter that these folks have to read other folks' handwriting. And it's difficult to read, and you end up with inaccuracies in the voter registration records as a result. This is a cost. These are all costs. We did do a survey 4 years ago on the cost of voter registration, and in Oregon alone, it was well in excess of $4 per voter when you added up all the costs at the local government level, the state level, of maintaining voter records and building your voter registration list on a continuing basis. And that the smaller the jurisdiction, the higher the cost. The larger the jurisdiction, the cost got a little bit lower. But overall, it's a pricey matter. And we still have this problem with voters falling through the cracks, as we see by those numbers from Election Day. Efficiency. Again, millions of those paper applications often flood the elections just before deadlines. And I'll show you some charts later that illustrate that. And it speaks to the efficiency of the system that nearly 1 in 4 eligible citizens is not registered to vote. I talk to a lot of elections administrators, and what they want to believe is that all of these people choose not to register. You will hear that a lot from elections administrators, and that's just not the case. And there are a lot of people out there who want to register, and in some of the early work of Eric illustrates that, and I'm going to be giving you some numbers in a few minutes. Pew's approach to this problem of data, and the first thing Pew does when it looks at a problem is it collects the data, and I've given you just, believe me, a small amount of the data and the numbers that Pew considered. But the approach to the problem was to bring in a group of people, 42 experts from 21 states. It included elections officials, academics, and technical experts. And they released a plan in May 2011 about how to upgrade the voter registration system. And that plan concluded that it's feasible using technology currently in place. You didn't have to invent anything new to implement a voter registration system that's more accurate, it's more cost effective, and it's more efficient. And you do that by making the process for eligible voters to get on the rolls more automated than it is now. You harness the power of data matching to update voter registration records that are already in the system, and you reduce the opportunity for fraud by identifying duplicate and invalid registration records. So here's the design. It falls into 2 easy sort of ways to think about it: better data in and better data out to the system. The better data in comes through the form of online voter registration, which is a trend occurring in the states, and one that this group that felt was absolutely necessary in order to make voter registration work better, and automated systems at motor vehicle agencies. And the better data out part is the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, as I referenced earlier. So think about it in terms of those 3 things. Let's talk about online voter registration first. Arizona and Washington led the way. And I have to correct this slide. It's actually 10 more states now allow voters to register online. Pennsylvania isn't quite there yet, but we expect them to get there hopefully soon. So we now have 12 states in this country. That's a good start. More states are interested, more want to move in that direction, because the advantages to both the voter and the elections administrator are numerous. In terms of the automation of the process at motor vehicle agencies, again, we point to Delaware as a state that's done something that's really done something significant in terms of making it better. When you go to a motor vehicles office in Delaware, there's a screen at the counter, and the customer fills out the NVRA-related or required questions and the "Do you want to register to vote?" question on the screen. It looks like a screen at the grocery store where where you pay your bill. It's small, and the customer is required to do that before they can conduct their business with the motor vehicles agency. Now, the advantages of that, of course, are numerous. One, every customer is handled in the same way. Two, you know that the clerk, or there isn't a clerk asking the question one way and the clerk at the next station asking the question in a different way. That's huge in terms of how voters are treated. And then when the voter does input that data, it's input electronically and it can be transferred to the elections official electronically. Most states now, the voter's filling out a paper form, it's handed over to that DMV agency. The DMV agency, through SneakerNet, somehow gets it to the elections officials who sit and input the data manually. The differences are remarkable, both in terms of cost. It's saved the state of Delaware. Now, Delaware is a small state, and so this number is not going to look too huge to a lot of you, but believe me, in a state like Delaware, it's significant. They reduced their statewide cost by over $250,000. The DMV agency was happier, the elections officials are happier, the voters are being treated in a more efficient manner, and we think Delaware has done something significant and very, very good. So let's talk about ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. That's the third component in this that this group recommended, and it is now operating and underway. What it is it's a tool that elections administrators can use to make their voter registration list better, both more accurate and more up-to-date. It's not a national voter registration database. It's a data matching tool where the data is, states submit their common sources of data, such as their existing voter files, their motor vehicles data, or other sources. And then it's matched against all of that data and some common sources of data, such as the first one here is the one I like to talk about, the Social Security Death Index. And then items like the national change of address data from the U.S. Post Office. And states get a report back then that says it looks like these voters have moved, these voters have died, and these voters, it looks like you have some duplicate registrations within your own state. It looks like we have duplicate registration here between state X and state Y, and so the states can work on those and try to figure out, did that person indeed move, contact that voter, and encourage them to update their registration in their new place or to cancel their registration in the place where they used to live. So the reports that the states get are, they can get a report on people that are eligible to vote but unregistered now, voters who have died, voters who have moved, voters who have changed names, voters who have possibly voted multiple times in multiple jurisdictions. For those folks out there that are very concerned about possible fraud, this is an effective guard on fraud to have the states communicating with each other like this. So this is how the data center works. If you look up here in the long blue column up there on the left, those are the voter registration lists. So those are submitted to ERIC. Then other state data sources are included: motor vehicle agency data, felon data, public assistance data, death record data, for example. And you can augment that even more with things like change of address forms, phone book listings, military data if you can get your hands on it, address histories. And it goes through the ERIC data matching engine, which is very sophisticated, has the most sophisticated algorithms available to you, things like naming conventions, The guys that work on this are very fond of pointing out that there's something like 24 ways to spell Muhammad, and Bob and Robert and James and Jim and John and Jack and Joe. All those naming conventions are taken into account. The possible matches are given a score, and those reports go to the elections officials where they can look at them and go, yep, it looks like we've got a match here. We don't have a match there. We can take action X based on this. It's a tremendous tool for the states to use and to communicate to their local elections officials, who are often the administrators of voter registration, and say, it looks like this list of people, we've got them down from Eric as, off the Social Security Death Index that they've died. You may want to look at that. Or you should look at that, or it looks like they've moved. Let's contact them and see if that's true that they've moved, and see if we can cancel their old registrations. So a tremendous amount of work can be done here. We have 7 states that are part of ERIC right now and who joined prior to the election. Washington, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado in the west, and Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware in the east. 2 sort of pods of states, an interesting mix of states. You can see that they aren't all blue, they aren't all red, they aren't all purple. There is a very good mixture. This plan has a very broad bipartisan appeal, because you not only get the integrity part of it, where you are matching your records and trying to figure out which records are old and out of date, but you have the access part of it, where you're getting information on who the unregistered individuals are in your state, and you can get information out to them on how to register to vote. Prior to the election, each of the states received those reports on who's not registered in their state. And we had some very interesting things happen when those reports went out to the states, and they did a mailing saying, here's how to register to vote. A lot of those people, well, I'm going to save that for just a second. Hold that thought, because I want to talk to you first about voters. They got those reports first, and in the next quarter, they'll be getting reports about voters who have moved, voters who have died, et cetera. Those first list maintenance reports will be delivered soon. Now, going back, sorry to be confusing about this. On the eligible but unregistered reports, the 7 ERIC states sent 4.9 million mailings to 5.7 million unregistered voters prior to the election. We have numbers that are newer than this new one I discovered right before I showed up here. So this number of new registrations as a result of these mailings is now up to 309,000. And so they got a very good return on their investment. The folks that are in charge of elections in those states felt like they had, at that point, done everything they could do to encourage people to register to vote. Now, those first-time mailings, the first time a state does this, they're going to be larger, because they only need to mail to these people once. So once they've sort of taken care of that first big mailing, subsequent mailings will be to smaller groups of people, and so and they'll be doing it over a time frame that's more spread out than right prior to an election. Let's talk a little bit about cost savings when you go this route of greater automation. I'd like to tell you about Maricopa County, Arizona, which has had online registration for quite some time now, a number of years. Arizona was the first state to do it. Maricopa County has figured that it has saved over $1 million in 5 years. It takes Maricopa County 83 cents to process a paper voter registration, and it costs them just 3 cents for an online transaction. They have reduced their printing costs by 75%. So you get more accurate lists, you get a reduction or near elimination of duplicate and invalid registrations. and you get a reduced opportunity for fraud and the perception of fraud as well. So greater efficiency, you flatten out that curve. Here's that example that I wanted to talk to you about. This is what voter registration looks like in Maryland, going back to 2007. And you know when that spike was, that big spike in the middle, right before the 2008 presidential election. Otherwise, it remains remarkably consistent. And so one of the efficiency challenges facing elections administrators is how do you deal with that spike in an efficient way? And we want to, through the use of ERIC, sort of even that out. Remarkably, you see the same spike in Virginia. And so it isn't just a Maryland issue. So I also just want to make a quick reference to privacy and protection of voters' privacy. We had the ERIC system evaluated by the Center for Democracy and Technology. We got advice from them on how to do it. We worked with them very closely. They gave us suggestions. Those suggestions were incorporated into the ERIC data center, and they have concluded that what was needed to be done in terms of protecting this data has been done, and in fact, this data is more secure than voter registration data. There's been greater measures taken to protect this data than is being taken at a lot of the states. So I'm going to conclude my comments here. I wanted to just mention one more thing, though, and that's online voter registration provides a great opportunity for the states to partner with organizations that have an interest in voter registration, such as the Overseas Vote Foundation, such as U.S. Vote, who are developing very effective online means to contact voters. And so it provides a terrific opportunity for the states and these organizations to work together to channel people to those online voter registration sites so people can keep their records current. So I will, how much time do I have?
We should take a few questions.
Okay. So I'd be happy to answer some questions, and Susan will tell us when to stop. I'll start with you, and I'll repeat the questions so that it can be done.
So right before the November election, Florida, Pennsylvania, Colorado, and some other states conducted large-scale purges of their voter registrations, and those were found to be largely erroneous. What protections does ERIC have to prevent that? And also, I was wondering how many actual confirmed cases you found of voters voting multiple times in multiple precincts.
Okay, did everyone hear the question?
My question was, right before the November election, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Colorado all conducted large-scale purges of their voter registration databases that were largely found to be erroneous. And I was wondering what protections are embedded in ERIC to prevent people being incorrectly purged from the polls. And I was also wondering how many confirmed cases you found of voters voting multiple times in different precincts, because that's consistently been found to be not a significant issue.
Yeah, I'll answer the second part first, because that one's the easier one, which is we didn't find any examples. In fact, we didn't actually look, because it's you know, that's a state function. That's not Pew's function to go in and look for that. But you know, there isn't any evidence that's been found that there's a problem with, you know, at least a serious, widespread problem with people voting in more than one state. I mean, I don't know of anybody that's found serious evidence of that. So, but I think there is an issue with the perception of that. That's undeniable. And to the effect that people use ERIC and use it effectively, they can sort of deal with that issue and show that they do care about that issue and that they are at least willing to look. So in terms of what happened in those states right prior to the election, I can't answer that for you. I don't know the details on any of those. You know, I know that if there were elections officials here from those various states, they might have a different view of that. But yes.
Yeah, I'm from Florida, and I don't know what you're referring to. I mean, there were some high-profile cases. I would just urge you not to necessarily believe all the headlines and dig down a little bit deeper. I mean, there was clearly some issues, but to call it a large-scale purge of voters right before the elections, it just quite frankly is inaccurate. But I'm curious as to the online registration systems as far as the verification of it. Is it a requirement that voter have a signature on file with the HSMV of their or DMV of their particular state in order to access the system? Otherwise, how do they get that signature?
The way that it's working in most states is that in order to register online, you need to already have a driver's license or a state-issued ID from your state. And then what happens in the back rooms of the computer rooms is that, John Lindback goes in Oregon and signs up to register to vote. I already have a driver's license there. I give them my relevant information. The DMV furnishes the elections officials with a copy of my signature from the driver's license agency, and that becomes the signature that the elections officials use for voting purposes. In a state like Oregon, that signature is vitally important because it's used to verify the ballot return envelopes, the signatures on the ballot return envelopes, because all elections in Oregon are conducted by mail. It's also the signature used to verify petitions, and Oregon is one of those states that has lots of petitioning going on for various reasons. And so I think it's fair to say that most states want that signature, and that's the way it's working in virtually all the states that have done it so far. Yes, down here, in yellow, right here. Yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I share his skepticism of. Okay. Yeah, no, I understand. I share his skepticism of taking an automatic action. I'm an election official, a local election official, and I guess I know that there are a lot of bad NCOA records or Social Security Death Index records, and I know that asking voters to opt in to being removed. And I don't know if you were the election director of Oregon when you had the test with Washington, the
Yes.
interstate removals.
Actually, I was.
It was a little better than 50% of people were responding. I guess I was wondering, do you envision your system becoming the front end through which people register, that a voter would be alerted at the time they go to register that they appear to have records other places, to sort of put that as a filter, put Eric in front of voters? Or are you sort of skeptical about going down that path?
That's a good question. We haven't really considered that yet, but I can see that possibly, coming up for discussion. Right now, we're just trying to get it up and running. We've got those eligible but unregistered reports out to the states, the first round, and we want to get the list maintenance reports out to the states. But I think one of the things that you mentioned is very important to mention here is that there's nothing about this process that changes the requirements that the states must live up to under the National Voter Registration Act in terms of contacting people before their voter registrations are canceled. This just becomes a tool to maybe speed up that process so that the elections official knows further in advance that somebody has moved than they know now. They still have to follow the federal law. Nothing has changed in regards to that.
Let's take one more question.
Yes.
Yes, you mentioned the importance about keeping the information private and secure. And I know there were a couple of articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post about two states, Maryland and Washington, which had the authentication code to change registration was the license number, your driver's license number. And that could be generated from public information. I'm wondering what you guys are doing to make the database secure given that authentication code.
Yeah, one of the considerations for states when they go into this is the authenticating of that voter on the other end, obviously. And Maryland and Washington do have a situation that's different from the other states that have implemented in that they have a way, your driver's license number in those states is derived by some kind of formula that everybody knows, and so it would be pretty easy to figure out somebody else's driver's license number. They're the only two states so far that have run into this situation, and they are working on that issue, on possible ways to solve that. I have to say, though, that Washington's had their system in place for several years and never had a problem with anybody trying to fraudulently change someone else's registration or fraudulently register someone to vote. They haven't seen that. If you think about it right now, that could be done on paper now, right? Well, maybe, yeah. But the answer was the scale could be different. But yeah, I don't think anybody's arguing that they don't need to do something about this. Both states have acknowledged that they do and are working on ways to solve that. But they did not see it, particularly Washington, as a problem that was so serious that it would warrant cutting off access to thousands and thousands and thousands of more of their citizens to registering conveniently online.
I think there was one person waiting here for quite a while, and that'll be our last person.
Okay.
What data points does the system look at when it's trying to match voters in two different states?
First name and variations on that, last name, middle initial, birth date. To the extent that the participating states have Social Security information, Social Security number information, they use that. And it's all graded. There are more data points than that. And then a possible match is given a reference score. And so if they're doing a match with another state and you see a reference score of 10, that means that Eric is confident that that's the same person. Or 9 or 8, then that confidence level drops a little bit, and so the elections administrator may want to vary what procedures they use in dealing with those different levels of matches. There isn't anybody in those 7 states talking about doing anything automatically at this point. They all recognize that each one has to be examined carefully and are using, more procedures than just looking at the piece of paper. All right, thank you very much. See you later for drinks.
That was excellent, very informative, and I think I hit next. Do I? Okay. We're closing in now on the end. This is going to be a little bit more rapid on changing with the last few speakers, and we're going to make a shift. This next shift is going to be to the all-important topic of youth civic engagement. We have to ask ourselves, what's a society if it can't engage its youngest members to treasure and execute on their right to vote? Our next 2 speakers will open up the discussion on this topic. The first is Peter Levine. He's a professor, philosopher, and author, and he'll address the topic of the effect of policy on the youth vote. Peter's director of Circle and professor at Tufts University. He strives to understand the foundations of civic engagement, and we actually have been looking forward to having Peter come and speak here at Summit for many years, so this is a great honor. Peter, if you'll emerge from wherever you are, I invite you to take the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So, you know how to do this. You're just staying.
I can figure it out.
Green.
Thanks for having me, Susan, and thanks for hanging in there out there. I do come from Circle, which I think the next slide will provide our acronym. How about that? Or even, I guess that's okay. Our little logo disappeared. So it's the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University, civicyouth.org. And I encourage you to check out the website, which has lots and lots of data. We were actually founded by the Pew Charitable Trust 12 years ago and moved up to Tufts about 5 years ago. And we're research geeks. It's in the title it says the Center for Information and Research, and we do lots of data crunching and calculate youth turnout and such, and focus on young people. We're not complete geeks, though, because we're not just interested in the numbers for the sake of numbers. I'd say we do have a pretty strong value commitment or agenda. It's not partisan. We don't care who young people vote for, or even necessarily if they vote, because we define civic engagement much more broadly than that. But we do want them active and thoughtful and helping to shape our country. Why do we want that? I'd say for several reasons, because participation in civic life, especially in politics, is habit forming, and that habit tends to form or not form in the early years. And so if we don't allow it to form for our young people, then for the next 50 years or 100 years, we're going to see unacceptably low levels of engagement. So that's one reason. A second reason is equity, because when levels of engagement are low, for example, when voter turnout is low, it's not just a random sample of Americans that's left. It's relatively privileged young people or people of any age. And so by raising the level of engagement, we get a more representative sample of people. Particularly in the case of young people, the gap between those who go to college and those who don't go to college in terms of their levels of participation is just enormous. It's about 2 to 1. And by the way, worth remembering that nearly half of young people don't go to college in the current era. So it's not some small subset of people who are not going to college. So that's the second reason. And I'd say a third reason we care is because young people, although they're not a kind of a voting bloc or an interest group, and they have very diverse interests and concerns, they are part of our polity, and they have somewhat distinctive concerns. Certainly they're affected by public policy in different kinds of ways than older people, so it's important for their voice to be in the mix. So what's been happening lately? I'm going to give you not a big dose, but it's some slides with graphs. Actually, I'll ask you to focus on just 2 lines in this complicated graph. They're the 2 parallel lines, the top one and the bottom one. And they're measures taken during recent election seasons, before Election Day, going back to 1996, of interest or enthusiasm or engagement in campaigns. So one question is, have you thought about the election quite a lot? And the other one is, are you following the election closely? And I think you'll agree they show the same pattern, which is pretty miserably low levels in the period 1996 to 2000. Only 35% of people, for example, thought about the election a lot. Rising, reaching a kind of peak in 2008, and then falling off by September or October 2012. So confronted with those data, I, who study young people's voting and get asked lots and lots of questions about it, pretty much thought that young people's voting would be down again in 2012. I didn't want to make a self-fulfilling prophecy out of that, so I tended to tell people, reporters and others, that I wasn't sure, that we never knew, but I, at least privately and probably publicly, thought that turnout would fall in parallel with those other 2 lines. But this is the actual turnout trend, and we have a magic formula. Actually, it's perfectly transparent. I'd be happy to share it, but based on using the exit polls as one input to the formula to calculate youth turnout immediately after an election. So by the next day, we always have a youth turnout estimate. And using that method, we can only go back to 1992, but you can see that, in fact, turnout did not fall significantly from 2008 to 2012. In fact, that's our day after estimate, but it ticked up even a little more. So there's really no difference between the turnout in 2008 and 2012. Which, if I now think about it, so how could people have been so much more engaged in the election, talking about it, interested in it, and also saying more positive things about one of the candidates, Barack Obama, in 2008 than they were saying about either candidate in 2012? How did they still vote at about the same rate? I think if we're going to talk about sort of psychological factors like, as we would say, enthusiasm or excitement in 2008, I think the kind of adjectives you have to use or nouns you have to use in 2012 are things like resilience or persistence or responsibility rather than excitement or enthusiasm. But it's interesting that the turnout was basically the same. Those votes mattered. So just in partisan political terms, those are 4 states in which the youth turnout was strongly for Barack Obama and the older people's turnout was for Mitt Romney. And the youth vote was a substantial size, so that in those 4 states, if you imagine that young people had either not voted at all, let's say the voting age was 30, or had split their vote evenly, then Mitt Romney would have won. And that's plenty of states to have made him president of the United States. So although you could say this about some other groups, it's a fact that the youth vote put Barack Obama back in the White House. I put this graph up mainly for a couple of reasons, but mainly to show. So what this graph shows is our day after the election estimates back to 1992 in the blue line, and then the Census Bureau's estimates going all the way back to 1972 in the other line. I'm actually colorblind, so whatever color that is. The lighter color line, you have to bear with me. That lighter color line doesn't go all the way to 2012 because we don't, as many of you know, we don't know what the census estimate will be until, it won't come out until March or so of this year. But I put it there partly to show a longer perspective and partly to show that our day after estimates are probably reliable because we've been kind of predicting the census estimates quite accurately for the last 4 or 5 elections. So what do we make of the local trend? Here I just chopped off the first few years to concentrate you on 1996 to 2012, and you could say, and a lot of the press coverage, almost all the press coverage says rising turnout. Rising and then plateauing, so that there's a tremendous amount of talk about the new normal. Young youth voters are back. The millennials, unlike the Generation Xers who preceded them, vote. They're energetic and active. They voted Democratic for a couple elections in a row. It's part of the new governing coalition in the United States, unless Republicans find a way to be competitive with them. So it's all a story of significant change in an upward direction for youth voting. Maybe plateauing, but plateauing at a higher rate. But you've already seen the longer trend. And just to emphasize it a little bit more, so this is the voter turnout rate for 1829 going back to 1976. I took 1972 out. Statistics, you can do anything with them. I'm trying to make a sort of a point, which is that in 1972 the turnout was higher, but I think 1972 was an odd year, an outlier year. It was the first year when young people could vote. There was a lot of hoopla around the lowering of the voter turnout rate, age. It was also Vietnam. So if we take that year out and we run the trend from 1976 to 2012, to me it looks extraordinarily flat. And the trend line, which is that automatically generated trend line, is in fact flat. And the real turnout rate deviates from that trend line only a little bit. And basically what you see is that 1996 and 2000 were bad years. And I think if you put that slide up, you might say youth voter turnout is flat. There were a couple of years in which the political circumstances could explain why turnout might be low. We're not only interested in whether people vote, we're also interested in whether they vote knowledgeably. I think that's a little complicated because you're entitled to vote on a lot of bases, including trust in candidates or optimism about character of one or the other, but we still want them to have knowledge. So I want to give you a little bit of a kind of snapshot of where young people are on and what they know. I feel a little uncomfortable about this always because what young people know is a big issue, and what older people know tends not to get that much attention. And except sometimes on late night comedy. And in fact, when you directly compare, young people often do quite well comparatively. In fact, occasionally they actually beat older people, possibly because they were more recently in school and learning this stuff. Young people's knowledge is so when we come up with sort of negative findings about young people's knowledge, the risk is that people will say, well, it's too bad that they vote, and that would only be a valid inference if you also thought it was too bad that everyone else votes, because young people don't do worse than older people. But young people's knowledge is a legitimate social concern because we do actually try to teach them in school and in college. And so tracking what they know seems like a valid thing to do. So I'm going to show you a couple slides. This is from a survey that we ourselves did, more than 4,000 young people right after the election, went to the field the day after the election. Nationally representative sample. And we asked a bunch of knowledge questions. That was the focus of the whole survey. This is from one battery of questions which I think was unusual, and it was sort of looking at the campaign-related knowledge. And the premise is partly we couldn't ask a million questions because people will only answer questions for a few minutes and then on a telephone, and then they'll get tired and drop off. So we had to be quick, parsimonious. But also, it's not necessarily self-evident to me that you should know about everything. What seems to matter is that you know about the things that are motivating you to vote. So we asked people for their top issue, the issue that mattered the most to them. Then we asked them 2 knowledge questions about where the candidate stood on that issue. And then we asked them about their own opinion about the issue. And what it produces is a spread. 32.8% of young people can't, these are the people who could pick an issue, who just chose as an opinion question what their most important issue was. 32.8% people just got the knowledge questions wrong or couldn't answer them. So if they picked the economy and we asked them 2 questions about Obama and Romney's position on the economy, they couldn't answer them. 42.7% got 1 correct and 32.8% got both correct. I'm not sure I'm going to put a value judgment on it. I'll leave that to you. I think it would be fair to say that most people had some knowledge and few people had lots of knowledge. So perhaps that's not surprising. Before I forget, though, I mean, we're not just interested in giving a report card. We're interested in trying to figure out what drives this. And so there are lots of questions in our survey about background experiences. And there was a very, very powerful correlation between being able to answer this question well, and these are young adults, remembering what I would call high-quality civic education in schools. We didn't ask them whether they had high-quality civic education. We asked them about a lot of civic education experiences. And if they could report that they had those experiences, they did much, much better on this survey. Now, that doesn't mean that civic education caused that. More complicated than that. Could be that if you go to an excellent school, that you're also probably from a privileged background, that's what's driving your better knowledge. It's not just the civics class. We're looking into this more. We've looked into it in the past, too, in different ways. But I think it's still important to note that those knowledgeable voters are people who recently had good civics classes. And the non-knowledgeable voters and the non-voters are people who did not recently have good civics classes. So it's worth at least bearing in mind that relationship. This is a different kind of question. I don't have that many more slides, so bear with me. These are really general. This is like giving them a civics test. These are really general knowledge questions, and they're very conventional, which is why we asked them, so we could look at trends and compare them to older people. So who has the right to vote in federal elections? There were some choices: citizens, taxpayers, residents, and nearly half of people get the answer right, but a little more than half don't get it right on a multiple choice question. How many votes does it take to overturn a veto? Most people don't get that right. I think, again, I'm going to try to avoid value judgments, but I personally wonder how important that particular kind of knowledge is. In my mind, almost more important is knowing which party controls the House of Representatives so that you have some sense of who you're holding accountable. And they're 42% correct, most people incorrect. This is one where we have recent data for the whole population, very, very similar. So young people are not less informed about that. Which party is more conservative? By the way, I've asked graduate students in public policy which party is more conservative, and they all say they don't know because they're all so sophisticated that they're not willing to say that the Republicans are more conservative because conservatism means all these different kinds of things. But generally, political scientists think it's good to know that the Republicans are more conservative and the Democrats are more liberal. It gives you an orienting framework for making decisions. And a majority of young people can do it, but a bunch can't. Maybe some of them are very sophisticated, but I think a bunch of them just don't have any idea. And then the last question is, does the government spend more on Social Security or on foreign aid? What is the correct answer? Right. Social Security is the correct answer by about 20 times. But most Americans don't know that. That's true for young people, 51% of whom said foreign aid, and it's true for older people, though I think a little less bad. One more knowledge, and I promise only a few more slides, but one more knowledge question. This is very relevant to the kind of topics discussed today. And I see this one as a little bit less of a test of the kids' knowledge and a little more a test of the voting system, because we asked people what the rules were in their state regarding early voting. Could you vote early? Was there a 30-day in advance registration deadline? And do you need to show photo ID at the polls? And then we checked against the actual numbers in their state. And, basically very few people get it correct. Incorrect or unsure outnumbers correct on all those issues. On the 30-day registration, really very few people get it correct. And I guess you could argue that's a failure of civic education or of the young people paying attention, but I think it's also a feature of an incredibly complicated and rapidly changing electoral system, which is extremely hard to understand. And not knowing this matters in different kinds of ways. If you think you do need photo ID in a state where you don't, maybe you're discouraged from voting, maybe not. If you think that you can't, that if you think there's no 30-day in advance registration deadline, and there is, and you try to register 15 days before, that's a real problem. So there's different effects of these, but they seem to be significant. Right. So I've sort of alluded to two ways that states can influence these things that we care about. That is knowledge and participation. And when I say state policy levers, of course, we're interested in that because you can change state laws. It doesn't mean that they're the most important thing. Presumably, families, churches, the media, lots of things affect young people's civic development. Not just presumably. We know that for certain. But states can affect it too, and there we have some choices, and every state does it differently. And I would be interested if you have questions or comments about other domains, but I guess I think of there being two big domains through which the state can appropriately influence young people's engagement levels. One is civic education, broadly defined in schools, and the other is voting laws. So a little bit of evidence, and then my final slide is kind of a discussion one. Civic education. So I just told you that whether you had a civics class seems to be a powerful, powerful predictor of whether you vote and whether you know what you're doing when you vote. And I didn't show slides with that, but these differences are 30, 20, 30, 40-point differences. But that doesn't mean that civic education policies that exist in the states today make a difference. Because, first of all, civic education policies in the states don't necessarily affect what happens in the classroom all that much. And secondly, because civic education policies in the states probably are generally not very good. And so they're not really, if there's a lever there, it's not actually being pushed. So this is, in a way, kind of a murky slide. And if you find it murky, that may be okay, because in a way, what I think it shows is that civic education policies are not having that big an effect. But as a quick and dirty way of trying to see whether it mattered, we looked at whether states had changed their civic education policies in the last 8 years, either weakening them, strengthening them, or leaving them alone. And that divides up those three groups of states. And what's being measured is young people's turnout in the last election. So in states that strengthened the civic education requirements, well, turnout went up in 2008, fell off again in 2012, though. And they're the states also that started with the highest the highest turnout. And that's part of a very pervasive pattern, which is that in the states that have the more friendly policies to youth voting, whether in terms of schooling or the voting process, you almost always have long histories of higher engagement anyway, going back often 50, 80 years. In the states which have the least friendly policies, you almost always have low turnout going all the way back. So it's a little hard to tell what matters. The states that weakened their civic education requirements, you see a turnout decrease and then a tapering off. But again, they started the lowest, and the difference is not huge. And there's lots of ways that this is a quick and dirty kind of analysis. But it brings me to the other question, which of course is, what about this enormous variation in state voting laws, everything from photo IDs to early voting to election day registration? It's a big, complicated topic. There's a huge literature. We've actually published a lit review, if you're interested, which just tries to summarize the literature. There are points of unresolved debate, I would say. But as a quick approximation, I'm not sure that the effects on voter turnout rate are very large. So here's again, looking at change from 2008 to 2012 with all those new laws in many states. The states that had a new voter verification measure, like a photo ID law, in place by 2012 that hadn't had one in place in 2008, turnout up by a point. Probably meaningless, statistically insignificant change and not meaningful, but if there's any meaning there, I would suspect it might be because those were states where there was a pretty powerful backlash against the photo ID laws, like Ohio. Second sort of category is bills which I think is red, which is bills introduced but then somehow blocked, and that shows a mild decline in turnout. And then the states where there was no bill introduced at all, interestingly, those are the states with the highest turnout to start with. Again, states which typically have friendlier attitudes towards youth voting and voting in general, but there's also no change. So I think this is my last slide, and what I want to use it to do is to pose a kind of discussion question. So we have formed a academic scholarly commission on youth voting and civic knowledge, funded by the Spencer Foundation, the Bechtel Foundation, W.T. Grant Foundation, Chicago Community Trust, McCormick Foundation. They will be deliberating this spring. A lot of the evidence that I showed you is just sort of the tip of the iceberg of lots of data we're giving them. That arrow was supposed to point to our logo in the bottom so that you could tell that you could follow the commission, which is at civicyouth.org. It's fine that it doesn't. In fact, it gives me probably a more pointed way to tell you to go to civicyouth.org. But so they're going to do the deliberating, and we are just giving them the data. We chose them too, and we're sort of the staff. But they have the problem to wrestle with, and I don't. But I think this is the problem. It's that we know that an individual kid who gets either high-quality civic education in schools, or certainly whose parents or others in their neighborhood involve them in civics, but that's hard to change, or who gets contacted by a political party or political movement and asked to participate, that they are much more likely to engage. So the individual kind of level involvement or being incorporated is very powerful. But we also, I think, are hard-pressed to find a recipe in the form of an existing state law, whether in the education domain or the voting domain, that makes that happen a lot. And so, so that's why we see a flat kind of turnout trend over 30, even close to 40 years. So if you're a scholarly, non-political commission on this, and you want to make research-based recommendations, I don't think what you're going to be able to do is come up with the recommendation that everybody should do what Massachusetts does or some other state. I just don't think there's going to be evidence of that kind about the success of any particular state in solving this problem. So I think the research-based suggestions are going to have to be a little bit more based on kind of general understanding of how politics and civic development works. But they're ultimately going to be recommendations for completely new policies that we don't see in any of the 50 states or the District of Columbia right now. But if I have time for questions, be happy to just try to address factual questions. But if anybody has a policy proposal, we could certainly use one.
I was wondering if you were at all concerned about the potential for new media forms of social engagement to actually cannibalize youth participation in traditional electoral politics, and that now young people can create a YouTube video or join a Facebook campaign or something like that and see a very immediate impact of their actions with very little effort versus all the effort that they have to go do to register to vote, to support a campaign, and that sort of thing.
Right. So it's obviously a good question, and it's part of it kind of, as you probably know, it emerges from a whole big debate. And there's lots of evidence, and I'm not going to settle it. If I just have to answer quickly from 30,000 feet, I think generally there's a positive correlation between online engagement and voting. So instead of cannibalizing, it seems to be either actually augmenting voting, or at least the same kind of people, the active people, the engaged people, are doing both. So I don't really fear cannibalism, although that's not a definitive answer, and I know there's lots of debate. But what I do fear is something different, which is a gradual move over 50 years from a politics of recruitment into a politics of sheer choice. So, I mean, it used to be further back than my slides permit, because youth voting only goes back to 72. But before that, it used to be that typically you got recruited into civic life because you sort of had to be. You were in a church, a union, a political party, a newspaper's zone, and all those entities, they weren't really providing you with a choice. They were what they were. They all had a desire to get you to participate. And we've moved gradually towards millions of channels on TV, millions of news options, weak parties, no unions, and so everything's now a choice. And what that does is it cements gaps. If you're young and interested, you have both YouTube and voting, and you can do it on steroids. But if you're not interested, you don't have to find either. And you find YouTube, but you don't have to find the politics on YouTube. So I'm worried that in a system of pure choice, we're going to see very stark differences in engagement.
There's one last question.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And very provocative and very exciting. And
Good.
and
Something wasn't
the data,
depressing.
the data are powerful. And the flat line is, I guess, a little bit unsurprising to me, and as someone who is a social scientist, that, and you're going into this wonderful endeavor working with the commission. And that the question is really a comment, but I'd love to hear your response. And that is, we have, an institutionalization phenomenon, an intergenerational phenomenon that is at least hinted at with the education differences and the learning process and the shifting demographics in our nation. And so one part of it is we're recreating, the activism. However, that's where the millennial generation, I think, is inclined, speaking as a mother of a teenager, to educate their own. And the incentive is there, and it's powerful. And I'll plant a seed, and it's this. My daughter wants to go into a disadvantaged school area as a consequence of her Girl Scout engagement to work with the STEM program for the science technology with girls in another school. And so they are different. And so the outreach opportunity for those less engaged or less inclined to be engaged or at risk, greater risk for not being engaged.
So thank you. And just a quick comment, which I hope will be responsive to that. There's this big debate about generations. I mean, each generation, I was an early generation Xer, so I remember it well, and millennials now. And it's mostly a thumbs up or thumbs down kind of debate. So I have a collection of books on my shelf, the dumbest generation, which is about the millennials, and then the basically the best generation. I can't remember the exact title. And there's always a sort of a positive or negative verdict. If I have to vote, I'll actually vote positive on the millennials, not just to be nice or in a genial sort of spirit, but because I think there are basically positive trends, subtle but positive. Volunteering is up, voting is up a little, at least compared to the 96 and 2000. But in other ways, we just read that the high school graduation rate is up. However, I guess I basically push back on the utility of the generational label. I mean, my graph shows no change. So all the hype about, my generation, supposedly, what happened to us, we weren't voting. Actually, our turnout rate was just a little below. And these kids now, they're back, they're the Obama generation, they're running. Their turnout is back where my generation's turnout was. And sort of following up and this is my final comment, but following up on what you said about educational differences, the problem with generations is it obscures enormous differences among the people who are alive or young today. So then you say, well, the millennials, something about them. Some of them are dropping out of high school when they're 14. We have almost a 30% dropout rate. Some of them are finishing PhDs at MIT. They're just tremendously different. And so the gaps, if I had put trends for different demographic groups on the same graph, those differences would have been so much bigger than the differences over time that I just sort of basically don't think generationally. But that may be quite a good segue to our next speaker who does.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
Okay. We're not doing really good on going faster, but it was fascinating. I think a very different kind of presentation than what we've ever had at Summit. And I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. I'd like to segue to Matt Segal here really quickly. He wasn't here earlier when we presented him his award, but we still kept it. And it's in here. So, Matt, you get to have this. We talked all about you. We're not going to talk all about you now, but whoops. But a little bit. First, Yeah, well, we changed the time on them, and they don't read the fine print. They're young.
But
they.
This is your award for
I'm really honored. Thank you.
for service. I'll share with you afterwards the kind of words I said about you.
Right.
Sounds good.
He
Thank
did
you.
not talk about the fact that you're the first person under 55 we ever gave an award to.
I appreciate
but-
the award. And I said I never miss an award, and that's because I never get any. So,
Well,
except for today.
anyway, stay up here. I just want to say that, and I'll put this
Yeah.
under here. Matt really stands out. The work of his organizations in empowering young people to care about the elected leaders they have, to participate in the process. He has a lot to say, and he's saying it all over, from CNN to Bill Maher, and it's great to see you out there, a really incredible voice. He's also really good at getting things done. Thank you for the 10,000 voters in one day that you sent to our fledgling website. That was a real boost. Anyway, I'm going to turn over the mic really quick, and I believe everything is set up here. You just have a green button to push.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Okay, and Alex is here in case.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Susan. And I'm so sorry I missed the awards earlier today, but I do want to quickly say I have been a huge supporter and an advocate and proud advisor to the Overseas Vote Foundation from the very early days. And I can't speak highly enough to Susan and Claire and Marina and Jane's work and so many of the volunteers who've been a part of it as just a motivated group of citizens who want to see our democracy more inclusive. And they're tireless and they're persistent and they're inspiring. So let's give Susan, if anything, a round of applause. So I know Peter, who I have great respect for, is an incredible researcher, but as he noted, he's not a millennial, so I'm here to actually respond to any of the allegations that he or you raised and speak directly for my generation if you want to have questions for me. And I'd actually like most of this time today to be question and answer oriented, but Susan has prompted me with the task of identifying what obstacles encumber a more participatory and engaged democracy or citizenry in my generation, and how I can offer some insights into how we can create obviously a more ubiquitous culture of civic involvement. So with that said, I first actually want to say, as Peter did, that youth voting is up, as you guys know, in 2012. We were thrilled that younger people were 19% of the electorate, which is certainly bigger. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm part of the largest generation in history, the most multicultural, the most highly educated, and a generation who has totally different viewpoints in how we view globalization, how we view different cultures, and how we view social tolerance and acceptance among each other as citizens. So I think that will bode well and certainly change the course of how we vote and participate over the next few decades as we come of age and become an even larger share of the electorate. Secondly, I want to say that despite many young people not voting, I do not believe in the concept of youth apathy. In other words, I think every younger person in their teens, 20s, believes and cares deeply about different issues. The question is whether, and that, by the way, is evident through not only the volunteerism rates that Peter suggested, but the fact that we're starting businesses and nonprofits and that we've basically created this whole new culture of social entrepreneurship, which is unique to our generation. But I think it's entirely possible that the notion of democracy and the vote in particular, which is our prime measure of democracy, is becoming a somewhat obsolete measure for a generation who has unprecedented agency through technology and social media. And I don't just say this as someone who uses and lives online and spends a lot of the time of my day interacting with fellow members of our organization and my generation online, but I say it as someone who also did study sociology in college and recognizes that the rise in technology is absolutely going to create an instant gratification-oriented culture where we have a culture that is fundamentally at odds with our legislative process, such that I can walk into any store or fast food restaurant and get a meal instantly, such that I can go online and search for something on Google and get information immediately, such that I can certainly hit an app on my iPhone and have a car or an Uber cab or taxi next to me, waiting for me within minutes. So when we have this unparalleled agency and result-oriented culture through technology, as you can imagine, when we vote by proxy, or when we essentially then tell representatives to vote for our interests through a divided, and one could argue right now, certainly stymied government that does not yield immediate results, that creates certainly a legislative process that is confusing, antiquated, and certainly at odds with the general technological culture that my generation participates day to day in. But that is not by any means to say that we do not care and we're not interested. We're looking for a way to innovate our democracy, to bring it more into the 21st century. So that said, I think first and foremost, our organization, and I'll figure out how to use this slide here, spent a great deal of time. I'll get back to those if I can. Spent a great deal of time registering voters in a fairly new way. I would actually make a bold assertion that the campus voter registration drive, as you might know it, is slowly dying, if not dead. And that's because the way that organizations like OurTime.org or like Rock the Vote or a lot of these youth civic engagement organizations, OVF, are registering, and YVO are registering people, is by embedding their voter registration tools online in the already saturated places where young people live. So our organization's strategy this year was to build this online voter registration tool that we were able to put on the homepage of Starbucks.com, as you can kind of see, even though I'm sorry it's not bigger, or the front page of Tumblr, or under every single politics article on Huffington Post. We were able to convince those sites that get massive traffic and distribution among younger people that if they embed this tool, they will get not only more impressions and eyeballs, but will create a much more accessible way of young people to register. So by virtue of saturating these online sites, here's karmaloop.com, meetme.com, which did homepage takeovers around National Voter Registration Day, Upworthy, which is a great media site, all did pop-up boxes for us to help us register voters. So when historically we would put our time into forming chapters and trying to get campus reps around the country to go door to door or lunchroom to bookstore and register people, now it was more about us wrangling the CEOs of media sites and sometimes major Fortune 100 or 500 corporations to feel a sense of obligation to create voter registration opportunities through their web platforms. So I think to the extent that we can create a culture that not only encourages our businesses and our social media sites and our media destinations to engage more heavily in online voter registration, but then of course you go through the notion of graduating to a more inclusive 50-state culture of allowing online voter registration, not just in roughly a dozen states that have it now, you will see voter participation certainly become easier, which will correlate with the ease of use society that we have, which is to say that I can, of course, bank online or order a cab through my iPhone or certainly get any result I want on the web within seconds. So that is definitely one. That said, and I know there's been many debates, especially among probably this community, of whether we should vote online. I will say I think the tides are going to eventually get there. However, I'm very dubious, of course, and concerned, as you are, about the security measures of online voting right now. And I think we have a long way to go to be able to show that it's not hackable or certainly prone to any sort of malfeasance or manipulation before we go toward direct online voting. But in terms of online registration, I'm a huge advocate, and I think it's a no-brainer. And I would even, as our organization and most young people we've talked to do, support federal legislation that would take us in that direction. But in the meantime, we'll certainly encourage more states to follow the suit of the first few that adopted that. The next thing I actually want to say is regarding motivation of younger voters. And Peter touched on this for a brief moment, but policy barriers were a huge frustration to my generation this election. Particularly the notion of eliminating early voting days, the notion of photo ID restrictions, the notion that we, of course, were told as students were that if you live in a dorm, that does not constitute a proper address. And then as we've recently seen, the long lines, those policy barriers play a very frustrating role in encumbering turnout and also demonstrating that we have a long way to go to reform the system to welcome more younger people to play a part in it. And so I think that is one of the bigger focuses we need to have as a society, which is how do we create and optimize access? Because like I said, culturally, we're moving toward ease of use and access in every other part of our existence except for democracy. And in fact, we have been regressing in the sense of a policy standpoint of how easy or difficult it has been to vote. The last major demotivator for my generation is the broken political culture we live in. And I don't know if this has been given a lot of attention today, but the notion that you have flooded money into the political system, the lack of disclosure from people who do put unfettered amounts of money into the political system, the notion that money today is speech, and corporations are people, creates a sentiment that I can back up with fact and data, not just an opinion, that many young people feel if money is in fact speech, then the rich have more of a voice than they do. Because economically speaking, not only are we a cash-strapped generation, but we certainly face disproportionate amounts of unemployment, underemployment, student loan debt, credit card debt, and so forth. So if we need money to speak in our democracy, then our democracy is actually no longer one person, one vote. And I think until we take on a more comprehensive view of government reform, of making sure that people disclose the money and that we have campaign finance reform, we're never going to boost voter turnout because people are going to fundamentally assume that the system is rigged and that their vote doesn't count. And so that needs to become something that GOTV and voter turnout advocates focus on heavily as a major barrier toward our participation. The last thing then in terms of moving toward the, rather from demotivators from the part of our broken political culture, is the notion that we have such stridency in our political debate as well. Our generation rejects the notion of this us versus them culture that we have in our cable news. The fact that there is a false dichotomy, the fact that there are two sides to every particular debate or issue. And the more that we polarize our society and the more that we hear the party's pure purpose to be to win re-election and defeat the other rather than collaborate, we also lose a motivation and belief in the competency of our leaders and of our government, which of course will also in many ways cannibalize voter participation. So it's really critical that as voting advocates we fight that culture and stop looking at things such through this false binary paradigm that I and so many of my peers fundamentally reject. So now moving toward how we can get more younger people motivated, first of all, besides reversing those negative trends I just said, one is certainly better outreach. And I want to actually congratulate candidates over the last few presidential elections on both sides of the aisle that they've started to pour more money into youth outreach. They've started to appoint particular campaign staffers whose sole purpose it is to break down how policies affect our generation in a more salient language. And they've certainly put more money into youth voter registration drives. Because as Peter can tell you, as can I, the number one indicator of whether someone is going to vote is if they are asked to do so. And believe it or not, there are millions of my peers who are never asked or never directly messaged about being, registering and casting a ballot. So that is critical, and making sure that politicians not only go to where we live, which, yes, might be on campuses or in concert venues, but is also online through these websites that we're showing you here today, and through the celebrity Facebook walls and pages that we use from Will Smith and Lady Gaga and Usher and Will.i.am, to make sure that you're using culture, which does lead politics, as a major means of reaching our generation as well. But not to in any way belittle the fact that younger people might need culture to reach them. Believe it or not, we also care very deeply about issues. And the issues in this election that I was earlier hinting at, which will definitely demonstrate the shift of where our generation's ideology is, can really be exemplified through three particular ballot initiatives that were on several states throughout the country. One is versions of the DREAM Act, which over 60% of young Americans support. It is irrational to a multicultural generation that if you were in fact brought to this country at a very early age, that you cannot be a citizen of this country, even though you had no choice in the matter of being born here. Secondly is marriage equality. As certainly the president said in his inauguration address, to our generation and in our culture, the notion that you cannot express who you love openly without, equal protection under law is insane. And close to 70% of young people support marriage equality. And that's becoming such a no-brainer that if you're on the wrong side of that issue, you're probably going to start to get attacked from our generation, because we view equality in a very aggressive light. And part of that same version of equality has a lot to do with income equality, because the income divide in our country, which was exemplified through Occupy Wall Street, was also one of the most motivating factors for younger people showing up. But the third real issue that over 60% of young people uniquely support, compared, or is juxtaposed against seniors, is marijuana legalization. And that was heavily supported from our generation, not just as an indication to the fact that we may or may not like to get high, but more importantly, a fact that it has it's a pragmatic means of reducing our deficit, because we spend such a costly war on drugs. And of course, it breaks down so discriminately in the way that it disproportionately incarcerates black and brown men for these minor drug crimes. And our generation is acutely aware of that, partly due to our diversity and just partly due to our pragmatism. So with that said, I have some other things to say, but I'd much rather get to questions, because I feel like I have potentially, hopefully, instigated some thought or controversy, which is what I'm always trying to do. So thank you very much, and I welcome questions. Yes.
So thanks to online wizards at OVF and FDAP.gov. Thanks to online wizards at OVF and FEAP.gov, it's now and the electronic transmission requirements in the MOVE Act, it's now easier than ever for overseas voters to vote. The one remaining barrier to helping overseas U.S. citizens vote is getting them to start the process early enough, early like in January. And so overseas voting assistance essentially becomes a matter of communicating with young people. And so how do you effectively communicate with young people as government entities when trying to get them to follow the State Department or FVAP on Twitter is like trying to get them to friend the IRS on Facebook?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's not just the State Department or particular commissions. All of government has a difficulty reaching our generation. And certainly we communicate with different departments, agencies, and the White House in a nonpartisan capacity with how we can bring information to people. But I think there's a few answers to your question. One is the person who transmits the information. The fact of the matter is peer-to-peer outreach is critical for this generation. We do not necessarily love getting information from our parents or our professors or certainly different government agencies so much as we like looking at how we dissect issues through the vantage points of our friends. And there's no better indication into that than Facebook and Twitter, in the sense that when you scroll down a news feed on Facebook, you're seeing what your friends have to say. So I would say optimization or optimal use of social media and making sure that you're actually reaching out to nonprofit organizations like OurTime.org or like any of the many other groups who work with younger Americans to be your resource for basically communicating the information you have. We're here to help. In any way we can. It's part of our mission to engender a greater culture of participation. But past that, I'd also say employ these same websites, these same celebrities. I actually have a video here. I don't know if one of them plays. We used Chelsea Clinton. You don't have to put on the sound. We used Steve Carell. We used Larry David. We used Usher. We used will.i.am. We used so many different ambassadors from music and sports and movies to help basically give the same information you're trying to give, which is how do you register to vote, when is the deadline, and where can you do it. So by all means, employ culture and social media to the greatest extent possible, and also third-party groups who might have more credibility among our generation. Yes?
To follow up on this question, most of the young overseas voters that we've found through Democrats Abroad are students abroad. They don't go for the year anymore. They go for the semester. So it means when they want to vote in November, they only arrive in September or October.
Yeah.
So we can't start in January with most of these people. They're not there.
Yeah.
They don't arrive until later. So two parts of the question. Did you go after the overseas vote? And how can you help us go after the overseas vote?
Great questions. First of all, the answer is yes. And as Susan alluded to earlier, it was primarily through our partnership with OVF in the sense that our website and voter registration tool that lived on all those different media platforms, the first link on it was, "Are you a voter overseas?" ? And anyone click that button was forwarded directly to OVF to register. So primarily through linking people online, we were very concerned about the overseas vote. And to Susan and her team's credit, everyone had a great web experience on that site. But secondly, the best way to accomplish your latter objective, believe it or not, is something that I like to call institutionalizing voter registration with college campuses. And I'm a huge supporter of weaving in voter registration with college enrollment and matriculation and class registration every single year. This has been approached actually through federal legislation at one point in a bipartisan way. Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky and Congressman Stephen LaTourette of Ohio did introduce a bill called the Student Voter Act, which would essentially designate publicly funded universities and colleges, which is roughly 99% of them, as voter registration agencies for enrolling people. But you can also get at this not through federal legislation, which is just by pressuring college presidents and registrars to make a much more good faith effort to use their bully pulpit, for lack of a better word, as a means to educate their students who are either going abroad or enrolling every year about their responsibility to register and how you get it done. So we aggressively target the administrations of colleges, and we've asked our Congress to work with the college presidents in their district for that particular purpose. Yes?
Matt, I appreciate your enthusiasm and Like you, I got civically active as a teenager. And in the course of my working with the Marine Corps, one thing really popped out at me, and that is that while our college and university student rate is fairly significant, it is not the majority of the young people you are talking about in society. They work on farms, some of them work in factories, they work at gas stations, they work at fast food chains.
Some of them don't work.
And some of them are not working, and they're still living with mom and dad. And my son came home from college, and he's on his third job. Fortunately, he's just moved out, so the nest is empty again. Thank you very much. I needed that break. But I just want you to exercise just a touch of humility by realizing that all wisdom of your age group is not contained in just those students who go to college and universities.
Yeah,
there's wisdom out there all over the place in your age group.
And I completely agree with that. And actually, we registered more non-college voters than we did college voters, primarily by using the social media and pop cultural engines we did. And that's why I actually believe it's critical that more groups start to move toward those mediums, because, and why I earlier said the campus voter registration drive, which you might conceive of as the archetypal student or youth voter program throughout this country, is slowly dying, because now you do not need to go on a college campus, which used to be the only place younger people congregated, as the primary engine for reaching them. So you can absolutely go to concert venues and pool halls and wherever it might be, but the best place is through Tumblr and Reddit and Twitter and Facebook and all these social media sites where 93% of our population spends 10 hours per day. And that is a fact. Yes.
Hi. I was going to ask...
How many more? Just one more? Yeah.
How many more people have questions? Go over there. Yeah.
I was going to ask a question, but actually it turns out I'm going to give you information.
Great.
I was, just so you know, the Higher Education Act requires all the schools that accept any federal funding of any kind
to provide a good faith effort, but they're not enforcing it.
I know they're not.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about your opinion about them enforcing it.
Yeah.
And, but it is out there, and
exactly.
We've had a lot of luck locally providing people with postpaid cards that right in their student mailboxes, and a lot of them come back. It's been.
I'm a huge fan of that, and thank you for doing that.
And that's something I know that military voters get to do that is not applicable elsewhere in our system.
Yeah.
Great.
I mean, you're absolutely right. There was a proponent of the Higher Education Act that said that any school should provide a good faith effort to register voters, yet obviously good faith is very different than requirement. So we've seen some schools do an excellent job of registering their students, and some surprising, many community colleges have led the way at that. And then colleges you think that would be do an exemplary job of registering their student voters have barely done anything. So I would support, not only more good faith provisions, but Mr. LaTourette, formerly Mr. LaTourette, and Ms. Schakowsky's bill that would put some real teeth into that provision by making it a requirement akin to motor voter. So.
I think Bo has a question.
Yeah, last
Sure.
question.
I can reject, thanks. I'm with the National Campus, there we go. National Campus Voter Registration Project. Matt and I know each other, we go back ways. And just a couple things. One is College Campus has been engaged in this for a long time, and so much to the degree that you heard earlier that college students vote overwhelmingly more than non-college students, so we're doing a good job of that. But also, we partnered with Overseas Vote, just as your group did, to make sure overseas students could register to vote. Kids in America and kids overseas. I do find it ironic that we got engaged in this before it became mandatory, because for us and for young people, I thought young people don't like to be told this is what you have to do. So we said, when you tell people, well, you have to provide voter registration forms, the way to do that is, well, put it in a mailbox, put it out, and just kind of get the forms out to people. We said, no, that's not the way to do it. Part of what the mission of most public-private colleges and universities is civic engagement. That's part of what their whole core mission is. And so they've been very creative in getting students involved in not only just registration, because we think that's just only one piece of it. We think it's education, registration, education, and then getting them out to vote. And as you heard all day, they actually turned out to vote. So I'm just, I want to pat all those involved in higher education on the back because I think we've done an exemplary job.
Amen. Thank you. Thanks, Susan. Appreciate it.
Great. Let's thank Matt Segal. Outstanding.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And I did hear your very kind comments. Thank you. So we're in our final session now, and shifting gears just slightly, sort of expanding this now. I think twice recently, with the whole world watching, we have heard our president hang out the fact that voting really shouldn't be an endurance test. My guess is you all agree, or you wouldn't be here now. But I would imagine, like me, you know that that's easier said than done. Also, that with 10,000 election jurisdictions, what's wrong where is so variable. It's really not a good idea to totally generalize. There are lots of places with long lines and lots of places with no lines. There are some voting methods that are working fabulously well in some states and really not well at all in other states. And so it's tough. But we have to start somewhere, and I'd like to do that in this session by giving the opportunity for three outstanding advocates to tell us their views about what we might consider in the fix. And these three final speakers, they each know all too well that voting is, as a marathon, is simply not a long-term recipe for increasing turnout. I'll start by introducing Barbara Arnwine. She's the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And I honestly think no voting conference is complete without Barbara. She's a renowned activist for voting rights, and she's uniquely qualified as the leader of the Election Protection Coalition, which is the largest nonpartisan voter protection coalition, and it's really an honor to have her here today. I invite you to come up, Barbara, and take the microphone.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to talk today, and I want to thank the Overseas Voter Foundation for having the Lawyers Committee as a participant. Election protection was founded in 2001, right after the Florida debacle, and we've been going strong ever since because, unfortunately, there have been so many, election administration problems, so many legislative problems, so many voter suppression problems that it has really necessitated a robust election protection drive. In 2012, we operated a very strong program, over 150 to 200 organizations that worked with us, over 200 law firms, 5,300 legal volunteers, 2,300 grassroots volunteers. We have programs on-the-ground programs in 88 jurisdictions, 28 hotline centers, close to 2,000 calls, more than 1 million website hits, millions, just 3.4 to 6 million Facebook, Twitter, etc. Engagements, hits, connections. So, what I want to talk about today is going to our first slide, which is this is of course our intro slide, and then here's the map of shame. And, the map of shame became a ubiquitous viral tool during 2011. And when we first created it in April of 2011, in fact, it was created for Mother's Day programming and has since, taken off. And it became a really great educational tool for voters about where their rights were changing, what threats were existing, what states were up to what. The real lesson out of the 2012 election, and it's what we kept saying over and over to voters, is that Americans have to fight individually and collectively to overcome the barriers that make their voices hard to hear on election day. We said to voters, the only way we win against voter suppression is one step at a time. That ultimately we will fight in the courts, as we did and won in several states where those horrible voter ID laws, restrictive ID laws were instituted. And we said, however, that for the majority of the problems that you're going to encounter, the only way to win is one step at a time towards the polling place. That you got to stay in line, that you got to vote early, that you got to make sure that you take care of the VIPs, that you verify your registration, that you have the correct identification, that you're at the correct polling place. We went through all of this with voters, and the remarkable thing is that voters listened. And the fact that they still had to fight so hard, that they had to fight against these restrictive voter ID laws, that they had to really deal with the early voting cuts, the voter purges, the mass challenges, and the limitations to voter registration opportunities were all really problematic. And we're very happy that voters fought back and that they waited in line, that they did what we said when we said stand your ground, be persistent, operate to make sure that the legacy that you've inherited from Fannie Lou Hamer, from Medgar Evers, from so many people who sacrificed for your right to vote, that you continue in that line of civil rights and voting rights heroes. So, one of the things we had to deal with, of course, was the deceptive and intimidating actions. On the top is the ugly Ohio billboard that when we found out about it, because there were hundreds, there were about 100 of these billboards placed, the overwhelming majority in minority, Black and Latino communities, dead in the communities. And to the degree that they weren't in Black and Latino communities, for example, in one jurisdiction, there were 33 such billboards, 30 in Black and Latino jurisdictions, 3 outside of them. And the 3 that were outside, that were in the suburbs that were white, were all on freeways. But these were directly next to housing developments, directly in people's neighborhoods, just horrible. And we called up Clear Channel, we called up the other, Norden, the other agency, and said, take them down. They're absolutely deceptive, they're confusing. People think this means that if they have a felony conviction that they can't vote. They think it means that if they show up and they don't have the right ID or they're at the wrong voting place, that somebody's going to arrest them because that's fraud. You can't have that kind of confusion going on. And why are they anonymous? We said, where is the who purchased this ad, line, and how can you be putting out anonymous billboards that are this disenfranchising, this problematic, and why are they in these neighborhoods? Why are you implying by placing them in minority neighborhoods that minority voters are the most likely to commit voting fraud? This is absolutely unacceptable. And they said, too bad. You're upset. Oh, well, we got to make a living. First Amendment, so on and so on. And we said, yes, but don't you have a policy that says that you got to have somebody identify who they are on the billboards? Oh, well, it doesn't apply here, etc. And so we then took it to the streets. We started with, Color of Change and many other organizations, MoveOn.org, etc. We started petitioning. We ran our own petitions. We started, sending letters. We did everything that we could. And people on the ground were just infuriated. They marched. They did what they needed to do. And we made it a national cause. And interestingly, all of a sudden they discovered that they did have this anonymous policy and went to the purchasers and said, take them down. And while they were doing that, we put up our own billboards and said, you have the right to vote, encouraging people to vote. We did those kinds of actions, and we were very, very happy when Clear Channel and the other company decided to just take them all down throughout Ohio and throughout Wisconsin where they were there. So it was a fight. But these fights did one thing. I keep saying, and I've always said it, that when the strategy was created in in 2010 to come up with these deceptive and horrible voter suppressive practices and legislation and voter ID bills, I said they counted on everything. They counted on the fact that civil rights organizations don't normally have any money to do voter ID work, to do voter rights work in off-election years. They counted on the fact that everybody was overstrung with too much work. They counted on the fact that people were still in Obama election euphoria, whatever. But what they didn't count on, what they absolutely forgot about, is that groups like the Lawyers Committee would never, ever be able to sleep at night, look at ourselves in the mirror, and allow these kinds of horrible, devious practices to succeed. So the next thing that we saw, of course, is what we call recurring problems. That even though we had this new wave of voter suppression, we also saw that most of the problems that the average American voter encounters is the same problems: access to the ballot, inadequate planning and implementation, lack of confidence in the integrity of the process. And of course, the confusion around photo ID and other things that were happening across the nation was confusing to all voters. Recurring problems, again, here's just one example of a long line. I mean, I can testify about long lines. It took me 3 hours and 45 minutes to vote. So, you know, it is not just theoretical for me, it's real. And what we see happening over and over again for long lines: insufficient resourcing, inaccurate voting rolls, assistance unavailable to people who need it, who have a disability, inadequate poll worker training. I could go on and on about this subject alone. People who don't even know how to open an electronic poll book and working the polls. Could talk about polling place mismanagement, confusion over changes to elections because so many of the litigation in Texas, South Carolina, Pennsylvania went down to the wire, and there was a lot of confusion. Rules and regulation changes, all of these things led to the long lines. Priority reforms, you've already heard about some of them. Modern voter registration. We believe in automatic voter registration. We think that there is absolutely no excuse that our country requires people to register, and that there's so much confusion about when do you register, how do you register, how do you get there if you don't have a car, what do you do, all these kinds of problems that we don't believe should be different state to state, so people who call their friends and their family members in Texas and they live in Utah get different information, confused about what the rules and standards are. We believe that modern voter registration, automatic registration, using the databases that were talked about under ERIC and other systems would be just the way to do it, and that it could really make a huge difference for people. I will never forget, as a mother, that when my child turned 18 years old, that he received within 3 months of his turning 18 years old his selective service number and his selective service identification, but he got no voting rights card, no voting card. So we could change that. Expand voting opportunities, minimum uniform standards, commitment to resources, planning. And I'm going to spend most of my time, believe it or not, talking about planning. You see, in 2000, and after the 2004 election, the Lawyers Committee had to sue the state of Ohio. And when I say had to sue, we had to sue. I mean, we were looking at the problems around the lack of uniformity in that state, how people were treated so differently based on where they lived, and all of the problems that were there. And as a result of that, we actually brought a lawsuit, as you see here, called Legal Women Voters versus Brunner. And there was, a lot of problems there. And before I get into that, let me just talk about one other thing before I get into Ohio a little bit deeper. What Ohio represented in 2004, unfortunately, is a problem we see in 2012 in too many jurisdictions. Because of the under-resourcing of elections, we think that there are just too many problems that could be solved, but we're just not creative enough at solving them. I'm shocked as a lawyer that more election officials don't go to law schools and say, why can't you have your law students help to be poll workers? They understand how to use the law. They understand how to use technology. They're young, they're resourceful, they're very critical. Why is there no partnership in most states between law schools and officials? What about businesses, government, agencies? How do you diversify the poll worker workforce? I think that what we saw in Sandy, and I'm going to talk about Sandy a little bit more at the end, shows us what you can do when necessity forces. Because when necessity hit in New York City, they did turn to the law firms and said, can you send us poll workers? And the firms did. And they supplied the need. So we need to be more creative. We got to, as I was talking about these deceptive practices of telling people they can vote by phone and all the rest of this, we must pass the Anti-Deceptive Practices Act. We got to expand the voting, early voting. We should not have, all these restrictions on early voting. And we just have to keep working. And we just got to fix some of the problems we saw. We saw people who waited in line for 3 hours in Florida because when they got to the polling booth, they found out there was only one single optical scan machine serving hundreds of voters. One early voting site in Georgia, Notorious, had an 8-hour line to vote, 15 voting machines available, but half were being used because there were only 2 poll workers assigned to that location. In Michigan, we saw multiple polling places where there was confusion because voters did not know which line to stand in when you have these precinct-specific requirements, and there were no poll workers assisting people. You see, these aren't rocket science. These aren't the hard things to fix. So what we believe you can do is by following what we did in Brunner, is that you can create, the programs that will, in fact, allow for those systems to be fixed. Because what we required in Brunner, the logical fix, in that case to the ununiformity, to all of the problems and differences of treatment of workers, was to come up with an election administration plan where every county in Ohio was required to have a EAP, where it was just common sense. How are you going to conduct your election? What's the resource allocation? What's the security plan? What's the election day communication? How many times do we get calls from poll workers on the hotline because they can't even reach the state officials to get answers about how to solve different kinds of problems? Election day contingencies. What happens if there's a hurricane? What happens if there's a bad storm? What happens if you lose power? What happens if, things go wrong? Materials. What kind of materials are you going to have? What about the backup, regular ballots? Poll worker recruitment, training and accountability, voter registration, absentee ballots, production of a master calendar. All of these things the lawsuit required. And I must say, that this written plan has made a huge difference. Now, I'm not saying Ohio was perfect, because Ohio had huge problems because of their legislature and because of their very partisan SOS. But anyway, we nevertheless, and the citizens, as you know, had to run a petition, a very successful petition drive that forced the legislature to retract a lot of the bad legislation. But what we saw, though, on those other issues of just election administration, Ohio in 2012 compared to Ohio in 2004, dramatically different, dramatically. And we saw that they took care of these kinds of problems and really did a great job. And we were very, very pleased that there was just a real improvement. Cuyahoga County, we saw, great, resource allocation, that they had, that they were able to have, 101% of the current registration workers of all active and inactive voters available for each precinct. We just saw, just amazing improvements, and we really want to deal with that. On contingency day planning, Sandy accounted for so many problems for people in New York and New Jersey in particular. Neither state, of course, had early voting, which was a big problem, which exacerbated all of their problems dealing with Sandy. But we believe that you got to have these contingency plans for election, what did I just do? Oh, I'm sorry. That you got to have these contingency plans. I see it's just different here. My slides are different. It just, about backup plans in case of power outages, national disasters, all of these things. And we just have alternative polling sites, etc. So we believe that this is what we got to have. One thing I really hope that all administrations will think about is if your state sends first responders to other states in case of emergencies, you need a plan to make sure that they don't lose their right to vote. Because the saddest calls we got on election day and before election day were from first responders who had left all kinds of states, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, all throughout the country. They had come to help in New Jersey and New York, and they found out they couldn't vote because their states had made no accommodations for their right to vote. And of course, New York and New Jersey can't do anything about that. So we do need to be thinking about what kind of emergency absentee balloting procedures should be available to first responders. And that's, I'm going to stop there, but I just want to say again that if you look at the improvements in Ohio, it really is a lesson to every state. It's not rocket science. It's very, very simple, fundamental planning. And we haven't talked about race a lot today, because I've been thinking when I've been listening to the presentations, what are the racial differences? How does it play? But I must say that I am still disturbed that there's too much of a trend line that we continue to see in election administration, where the worst machines are sent to the minority communities, where the worst resource allocation is in the minority communities, where the worst planning, or the lack thereof at all, is in the minority communities. There has to be a change. And until there is a change, the Lawyers Committee, election protection, we will do what we have to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, you want us to sit, right?
No, yeah, please.
Okay. I didn't know about questions and answers.
I think we're going to move on. In fact, we're changing the order a little bit, but before I discuss that, I think that was a great presentation with some real concrete suggestions for everybody. And I think we just saw the realization of the definition of a fearless leader with Barbara here. Wow. We're going to change now on just the order of the last speakers. Larry Norden, who's the Deputy Director of the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, is going to come up next. Larry's the author of not one, but several books on voting technology. He's a speaker, and he's what I like to call a think tanker. In 2009, he received the Usability Professional Association's Award on Usability in Civic Life. And that was really for his pioneering work to improve elections, which, really I can't think of a better qualification for this little talk that he's going to give, or big talk, actually, I should say. And with that, I'm going to ask Larry to come up here right away. The clicker's up here, Larry. We're just going to, whoops. Here he is. Okay. Oh, here you are. Wow.
Well, thanks, Susan, and thank you to OVF. And first of all, I just wanted to say congratulations to OVF and Susan. This is a great event. And I was actually talking to Secretary Ritchie this morning and saying how incredible it is, all that you have done in such a short amount of time. So again, congratulations. The good news for all of you is I'm going to be pretty short because Barbara covered a lot of what I wanted to cover, but said it probably much more eloquently than I could. And I actually long ago vowed that I would never speak after Barbara, except I have to catch a train at 7 o'clock, so I bumped Carlos so that I could come up here to speak. I'm going to, let's see if I can figure this out. So, Susan actually, in her, I think, intro to this panel in talking about long lines, made the point that, we had very long lines in some places and not in others. But there's no question that the problem of long lines, I don't think it's any accident that President Obama has mentioned this twice in very high-profile events. The problem of long lines was national. These photos are taken from the LA Times, I believe in 7 different states, of what they described as incredibly long lines. So we saw this all over the country. And in fact, in places like Florida and Virginia, there were people in some polling places that were still casting ballots long after midnight, long after the election, the presidential election, had been called. I think a lot of Americans are offended by this just from a kind of customer service point of view, and think it's just as a matter of common sense that we should be capable as a country of solving this problem. That we shouldn't have people waiting in line so long to vote that they're actually fainting before they get to cast their ballot. But this also has real consequences in terms of election outcomes. Professor Ted Allen at Ohio State University recently estimated that in Central Florida, from data that he received, as many as 49,000 Floridians in Central Florida may have been discouraged from voting because of long lines. And there have been similar studies in the 2008 and 2004 elections by people like Benjamin Hyten and Henry Brady, of tens of thousands of people in certain localities because of long lines, not voting, getting discouraged from voting. I wouldn't say that at this point we know everything that should be done. I think before we know what can be done to solve this problem, we first have to understand the problem, and I think there are lots of studies going on right now to understand what happened in the 2012 election that caused those long lines. But we know a lot, and Barbara has mentioned a lot. And there are 3 things I'm going to touch upon quickly, all of which have really already been discussed. But the Brennan Center, at the very least, and we may be adding more to this list as we conclude our studies, thinks that these 3 things should be done to address the problem of long lines. The first is modernizing voter registration. The second is mandating early voting. John Lindback talked a lot about the first, as did Barbara. The second, Barbara spent a good amount of time talking about it. I think it's really important. And setting minimum standards for voter access. So I'm going to just quickly go through each of these things and talk about how how they contribute to long lines. So modernizing the voter registration system. John actually gave you some of these statistics already. There are over 50 million Americans who are not registered to vote. 1 in 8 registrations, Pew study showed, in the United States are invalid or significantly inaccurate. And 1 in 4 voters wrongly believe that their registration moves with them. So how does that contribute to long lines? Well, in a couple of ways. The first is that if you don't have accurate rolls and you don't know how many people are actually registered in a particular polling place, it becomes more difficult, obviously, to do planning. And you can have minimum standards, but if you don't know exactly how many people are registered when a presidential election comes along, you may not be prepared for the number of voters that you're going to get. The second is that if somebody's waiting in line for an hour and they show up and their name is Jane O'Dwyer, and Jane O'Dwyer lives at 210 Main Street, but she is registered as Jane Dwyer at 201 Main Street, when she gets up there, her name isn't in the poll books. And that takes time to figure out why it's not in the poll books. And eventually, when they can't find her after looking for some amount of time, she's given a provisional ballot, and that takes time. And so all of that contributes to a longer wait time for voters. There is a 2008 study from Harvard and MIT that says in 2008, between 2 and 3 million Americans tried to vote but could not vote, or their votes were not counted because of registration problems. So actually, let me go back. So this is the Brennan Center's recommendations for modernizing the voter registration system. You'll recognize a lot of these things from what John talked about earlier. We'd like to see voluntary automated registration of all consenting citizens, not just when they interact with the DMV, but really with any government agency. Making registration portable. Again, a lot of people already think it is when it's not in most places. When you move, your voter registration should move with you. And providing some kind of fail-safe so that if the government did make a mistake, if there was a mistake in transcribing 201 to 210 Main Street, that you're still able to vote, that there's a way to correct those errors. And we would like to see the federal government make that easier. I should say an additional thing is online registration, of course, which a lot of people have talked about today, would help make the rolls more accurate. So John and I have different numbers, I think, because I'm looking at numbers of states that have passed laws for things like automating at DMVs. They haven't already necessarily done this. These are states with portable registration. These are states with election day registration, which is obviously a form of being able to correct at the polls if there's some error. If there's some error, you just get to register at election day and vote. All combined, and these are states that have at least passed online registration and will have online systems up and running soon, and many of them already have them. So if you look at it, there are already 39 states in DC with one of these elements. So this isn't a crazy idea to think that we could combine all of these elements and really vastly improve our registration system to make the rolls more accurately and greatly increase the number of Americans who are registered. The Brennan Center estimates about 50 million more Americans could be registered if we did this. So I want to touch upon the second element, which is early voting. A couple of things about early voting. Until last year, the increase in early voting really seemed unstoppable, I think, in this country. Early in-person voting. Over the last decade, it's grown by at least 5 times the number of people who are voting in an early voting period. This last year was the first year we saw significant cutbacks in early in-person voting, and most dramatically in Florida. And in Florida, controversially, the cutbacks were greatest on days when blacks and Latinos voted most heavily, and most infamously, there was that controversial last Sunday before Election Day that was cut out. Initial results from a study done by the Orlando Sentinel suggests that minorities in Florida, and particularly Latinos, experienced the longest lines on Election Day in Florida. As Barbara mentioned, Sandy also showed the importance of early in-person voting, I think. There's no question that Election Day would have been severely impacted in New York and New Jersey under any circumstances with that storm happening 2 weeks ago. But the fact that in neither state did we have early in-person voting, that made voting on Election Day much more difficult. I was one of the people who had to wait a very long time in New York City on Election Day. If we had early voting sites in counties in New York and New Jersey that were impacted by Sandy in the week or two before Election Day, people that were affected by the storm who were staying with relatives, who were staying in hotels, could have voted if they were in the same county, if we had early voting, in one of the 5 or 10 locations that would have been set up in those counties. Obviously, people might have been able to vote when they went to work. Instead, what we had was no safety valve, really, and everybody trying to vote on Election Day. You had like super sites that were set up in tents in impacted areas, and the result was, I think, more chaos than a lot of people wanted on Election Day. And finally, I think the last thing that's really important and that needs more study is minimum standards. There are studies from 2008 and 2004 and 2012 that show that blacks and Hispanics are more likely to wait in long lines than others. So not all of us are affected equally by this problem, as with many problems in election administration, as Barbara alluded to. And we already have some sense, there has been some study on the factors that contribute to long lines. Again, people like Professor Allen have studied this. Ballot length obviously plays a role in the complexity of ballots, the number of registered voters, previous turnout, the voting systems used. All of those things have an impact. And anecdotally, anyway, we've seen from reporting already in 2012 that differences in resource allocation seems to have had an impact on long lines in 2012. And just to give one example, the Miami Herald reported that there was one precinct in Miami that served 8,300 voters. That precinct had 5-hour lines, whereas many that had less than 100 voters on Election Day, obviously, or not surprisingly, didn't really have any lines. So I think that's an area that's ripe for additional study in terms of what kinds of minimum standards would assist with this problem. But again, it seems like something that's very much a solvable problem. And I guess in conclusion, what I would say is that studies will help, but this really does seem like an eminently solvable problem. And I think the good news is all of the things that I have talked about here have a history of bipartisan support. The 3 things that I've mentioned have been supported by both parties historically and various states around the country. So from that perspective, it seems like something that we can solve as a country. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to back up real fast on the slide, so don't look over there. Anyway, we now have our final speaker who was he nicely shifted for us. So I'm going to just mention that in 2012, many of you may not know, but we created Voto Ausente USA, which we did together with Hispanic Communications Network. In fact, it wouldn't have been possible without them because they provided the language skills that we did not have. We have French, German, and a bunch of others, but no Spanish. Anyway, for us overseas, it was kind of like, well, you know, there are about 200 languages. Should we really focus on one? Anyway, over here, different story. So we had U.S. Vote Foundation and all that software, the online voter registration state-specific and online absentee balloting state-specific, and we thought, okay, you know, here's HCN. They want to do something with us. Let's do a pilot. And that's what Voto Ausente is and was, just a pilot, a little toe in the water to see if things would work and what kind of response. And how it was to work together as a team with HCN, which was great. The Voto Ausente site it really focused on absentee ballot services, producing state-specific forms, but only for 12 states, where we were able to identify with census reports really where the sweet spot was to hit about 75% of the Hispanic population. Yeah. Anyway, I want to introduce to you now Carlos Alcazar, who is the president and CEO of HCN. He's a media and marketing expert, and he really has worked a lot with diverse communities to get them engaged civically. He also, well, in a nutshell, he basically manages the largest social and cause marketing firm out there that's targeting U.S. Hispanics. So, Carlos, wherever you are, you're between this crowd and some Prosecco. After Carlos comes on, I will just say a few remarks to close. And thank you very much. Here you go. Great.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you for making me the last man standing between the Prosecco and these people. No, seriously, thank you. I will make this very, very brief, although I'm extremely distracted by the fact that I had shaved in one of these pictures and not in the other one. So bear with me. All right, I got 3 things I want to tell you about. I want to tell you, first of all, something that probably most of you in this room already know, which is how we did in the election turnout and some of the statistics related to that and how we're exploding as a population. Secondly, I want to probably repeat what Susan just talked about, which is the great collaboration and why we did that around votoausenteusa.org. And then thirdly, I just want to wrap up with some really quick remarks about how to engage with our community. So let's get started. The first thing, too early to determine the actual number of Latinos. Probably you guys know that already, who voted in this election. We do know, however, that Latinos were decisive and that they made historic gains, both at the state and national levels as it relates to not only turnout but also results. NALEO, which is the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, estimates that there were over 12 million Latinos that voted in this past election, represents about 10% of the national electorate. But there's an estimated 2.5 million Latinos who were registered to vote but didn't cast a ballot in this past election. That's what worries me. So how can we change that? And we're going to talk a little bit about why, again, and some of the tactics. Latinos voted overwhelmingly for Barack Obama. I'm sure most of you know that, by 71% to 27%. Unless you've been living in a cave, you probably heard that. Proud to say that my phone rang the next day after the elections, constantly for comments about what did they do wrong. Okay, in battleground states like Nevada, Florida, and Colorado, the support of the Latino electorate was critical to his success. And, you know, at the congressional level, we inaugurated the largest, or we welcomed the largest class of Latinos. And it's a big political milestone for us. I think there's now 28 Latino members in Congress, and we have 3 in the Senate. Just historic gains. But I think probably if you take away anything from what I'm going to spend time talking to you about is this one fact, this one figure. Every month there are 50,000 Hispanic youth, 50,000 Hispanic youth that become eligible to vote. Okay? That's a major number, 50,000. Start doing the math. We can register them. We can get them to come out to vote. This is really important. And having been so inspired by hearing my predecessors, the young man that talked about the innovative things he's doing, and I'm just so inspired about what we can do in the next election. So an innovative approach to the Hispanic vote came to us as we realized that absentee voting is one way to get around some of these long lines and all the things I've been hearing about for the last couple of hours that are challenges to getting us out into the polling places. That paired with the fact that 40% in a recent poll, 40% of Latinos responded that they talk about politics in the home in Spanish, that they prefer to have discussions in Spanish. And I'm not talking about young people, because I know that young folks that have been, the youth that have been raised in this country, we know they prefer to speak English, they're English dominant. But at home, there seems to be a lot of discussion in Spanish. It's probably because influencers, parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts are involved in the political discussion. So with that fact, we realized that this place called the Overseas Vote Foundation existed, and we reached out to Susan and Chip, and we just got the best response and the warmest response ever, and we teamed up and collaborated on the website. And the website, as she mentioned, is state-specific absentee ballot request services for voters, and it's only in 12 states, but it is in Spanish. It is in Spanish, which was the one thing that was missing, and we hope to really expand that. The key, though, was pairing that with a radio promotion campaign. So I run a media company, and we have the ability to be able to get out in mass numbers with messages and information and public awareness. So it's really important that we do a lot of public awareness about this, because it's a little known ability among the U.S. Hispanic community that you can actually do this thing called absentee voting. I mean, they don't really know that it exists, so we had to talk about it. What is it? How do you do it? It's legit, believe us. So why votoausente.org, and why the commitment, and why my personal commitment to see this over the next few years grow even further? Because in spite of our growth, Hispanics, our voter turnout is still way below expectations. And the reasons for that include, there are many reasons, but we have scheduling and traveling challenges of working people. We have two persons working household, multiple jobs, of childcare challenges, and then the stuff that to me is what we can overcome, which is the fear of the process. So the language, the not feeling welcome, the seeing the long lines, the hearing about some of this backlash towards immigrants. And then the last thing that I heard that is in parallel with what young people also seem to feel, that this idea of skepticism. And for Latinos, that exists. There are some of us that believe that just skeptical, that the vote's already fixed from our home countries. We may already have experienced that. Won't tell you what my home country is, so that we won't talk bad about them. No, I'm just kidding. We have that skepticism. So what do? We have to talk to them about the importance. So in spite of all the voter and civic engagement that we do, there's still a ton of voter education so that they understand that their vote is counted and that it's worth the effort. There was actually, I saw some stuff about voter suppression earlier. I think Barbara talked a little bit about that. I saw one of the most criminal things as it relates to voter suppression happen in our community. There was an ad that was put out by a group that started with an explanation of how the current party and the current administration, the Democrats, had failed us on immigration, and how they'd promised how they were going to do immigration reform, and how they'd failed. So the best thing that you can do as a Latino in this coming election is, guess what? Don't vote. They said, don't vote. This was a television ad. They tried to get it on the air, and fortunately, my colleagues over at Univision denied it, and they didn't let it go on the air. But meanwhile, it caused enough PR and publicity that it ran, and people talked about it and so forth. But it was just personally, I think, disgusting. Fortunately, we didn't let it get out into mass circulation, that kind of thinking, but it exists. So how do we engage? What do we do differently? I'm almost there. The wine, we're going to get there, I promise. I'm going to get you there to the promised land. Hispanic advocacy groups have been doing a great job mobilizing efforts on the ground. The key to working with Latinos is really an air game with a ground game. The air game is media, it's mass communications, it's doing online, it's doing television, it's doing radio, but it's also pairing it with the ground game, which are the community groups that are really involved on the ground. The NCLR, LULACs, NALEOs, and others that are doing great work through their affiliates in each one of these markets to get Latinos registered. Our media outlets, my partners at Univision, Telemundo, and the other major media companies were very committed to increasing voter registration and turnout. They had great donated airtime and programming. So I think both the air and the ground game are absolutely essential for those of you that are thinking about how you engage better with our community. And also important that you know that the key to make it relevant and to demonstrate the clear, tangible value of participating in the process. You can't make the assumptions that voting is considered a civic responsibility and that that's just enough. They have to see the clear, tangible values. And I think that some of that was evident in this past election and the turnout, and the reason my phone rang the next day, because you all understand now that Hispanics react to emotional issues that affect their families and the community. And so it wasn't all about jobs, actually. It was actually kind of about our families and how we felt welcome or unwelcome, what I call passion-driven mobilization. And so, when certain political candidates become anti-immigrant or they make comments about self-deportation, it turns a tide of passion-driven mobilization. And that's what happened in our community. So in a country with growing diversity, if one party is committed to expanding the right to vote and the other party is committed to restricting the right to vote, it's not hard to figure out which one will be ultimately more successful, at least in our community. But I think the last and final and most important thing that I want to say about is this idea of outreach, is that it's time to stop talking about reaching out with Hispanics, and it's time to start talking about welcoming in. That's the most important thing, is there's a lot of outreach, but we really need to feel welcome to come in and to participate in the civic engagement process. So with that, I say cheers, and hopefully we'll see you in the reception. Thank you, Susan.
Nobody should shake my hand, because as I sat here today, quite cold, I caught a cold. And that's me coughing like that. So that was quite remarkable. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you also to really everybody. As I said at the beginning of the day, we were going to go on a long journey together. Well, it's been a long but very enjoyable journey of one day. It's amazing what we can do in one day. It's really been tremendous. It's also not over, because talking to each other about what we've heard, talking to the speakers more, that's a huge part of Summit. I really have to say again, though, thank you to the speakers, the sponsors, the roundtable participants, and the audience, because only together do we get Summit. And this has been a great Summit, very different, just it keeps evolving. I love having you all here. You're already invited back, same time next year. We'll probably try to keep it here to have just, we keep hopping around town, around the world. Maybe we'll stay here at least a couple years in a row, because it's been so nice. Thanks again. We'll see you upstairs. Don't let me shake your hand, but we'll wait.